Good evening, and it's 7 o'clock on a Monday, so of course it's Red Line TV, and tonight we've got the issue that everybody is talking about. How can the cost of living crisis be solved? Is there a crisis? Why is there a crisis? What can we do about it? Is Labour part of the problem or part of the solution? And what is the role of the trades union in all of this? Well, first of all, we have Michael Roberts coming in to talk to us about the economics of it.
Hi, Jackie, everybody else. As you say, it's a burning issue in many more ways than more than one as today, given the temperature we've got at the moment, which is only adding to the cost of energy for people to cool down. And that's been one of the big issues in relation to inflation. If I can, Jackie, I'd just like to share a few graphs with you guys so that you've got a general picture that I want to present on the economics. So there we go. That's the situation in the UK. We're at a 40-year high for the inflation rate at the moment, over 9%. It's going to go higher, according to the Bank of England governor. It's going to hit maybe 11% before this summer is over. We're driven now by fuel prices and by food prices as well. And if you include mortgage costs, which this measure of inflation does not, then already inflation is up nearly 14% compared to last year. So this is a significant situation for everybody in the country, not just the poorest, but also across the board. Fuel prices near £2 a litre, and you can see from the start of 2020 how much it's risen dramatically in the last couple of years, and particularly in the last year. And that's really hitting the pockets of people who have to use vehicles to get to work or get around or to carry out their jobs. And the energy price cap, which regulators are supposed to be keeping energy prices down with, is allowing a massive increase in energy prices. We've just had an increase in April of something like 54% on average for energy prices for the average home. And there's going to be yet another rise in October and maybe even more, taking it up to something like 100% increase in energy if we get up to the end of this year. And people are obviously going to use a lot more energy in the winter than they are now. So this is, talk about a crisis. This is a really major crisis for people's living standards and conditions. And no wonder so many workers are considering to have no alternative but to try and struggle for higher wages and incomes in order to compensate for these huge losses, because there's no way at the moment that wages are meeting these price increases. And when the Bank of England governor says that wage rises are causing prices or will cause price rises, all I can say is, well, we haven't had the wage rises yet, and yet prices have rocketed by these margins of 10, 13% on average, and fuel even higher. So if we get wage rises, general workers and public sector workers are being offered 5%, rail workers similarly, on the condition that they basically cut their staff and carry out extra scheduled arrangements that the government was going to introduce yet more one-person operations on the rail and so on. All these offers are way short of anything that the inflation rise that we had now. And here's a figure which comes not from any left group, but from the official Institute of Financial Studies, which says that if we carry on at the present rate and trends, by the middle of the 2020s, the average worker in Britain will be £13,000 a year off than it otherwise would have been if it hadn't been for the inflation rises we're getting now. So in 2026, the average household could be on around about 31,000 compared to more like 44,000 if wages had risen at the same pace over the last 2 decades. And of course, they're not rising sufficiently anywhere near amount to meet the inflation rise. So this is a major cost of living crisis. And it's probably an unprecedented two-decade hit to earnings for the average household, with disposable income after taxes and after price rises and other deductions 40% lower than it otherwise would have been if wages had grown before the 2008 financial crisis. So here we are, 14 years after the financial crisis, and this is the situation for the average household as a prospect going ahead. So what are the causes of this unprecedented rise we see in inflation in the 21st century? Well, the head of the US Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, is supposed to be an expert on inflation. He's running monetary policy for the Federal Reserve, and he decides whether interest rates go up or down, or what they tighten on monetary policy, reducing the amount of money in the economy and so on. And he said only last month, we understand better now how little we understand about inflation. In other words, the rise in inflation has come as a complete surprise to the head of the US Federal Reserve and all the central bankers. They have no understanding really why this is happening. The bankers, the central bankers international agency is called the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, and only yesterday they made this statement in a report, which I think perhaps comes closer to the reality. The recent surge in inflation is not simply a story of excess demand, and people are trying to spend too much, but it's overwhelmed by the pre-pandemic trend supply of the economy. In other words, there is a slowing down of the supply capacity in the world. Things are not growing fast enough to keep pace with the recovery after COVID, and that's why we're seeing this dramatic increase in prices. That's the first reason. The other two reasons, of course, are the lockdowns in COVID, which has led to a major supply chain blockage, which hasn't been resolved. Trade has not picked up. Cargo ships, energy ships, and other things, food is all blocked in various ports or in the places where they're growing. And the third factor, of course, is, which culminates on top of all that, is the Ukraine-Russia war, where the breakdown of food and energy production, the huge sanctions being applied against the Russians, has meant that oil and gas has been in short supply, and the inability of Ukraine and Russia, for that matter, to get its food exports out of their countries is dramatically lowering the supply of food for millions across the world in the poorer countries who depend upon this food supply. Food prices have reached an all-time high. So within this crisis of supply, who is gaining and who is losing? Well, we've just heard that the Bank of England governor reckons that wages need to be controlled, but he doesn't mention at any time that profits need to be controlled. Now, this is a report by the Unite Union, which came out just a month ago, and they point out that over the last 2 years, whereas GDP in the UK has grown by just a little bit, 1.3% over 2 years, it's hardly at all an increase in output. Labour income has risen in that period by 3.6% before inflation, but profits have risen by 8.2% before inflation. So there's been a sharp increase in profits, and that's just in the last 2 years. There's been a big increase in profits over the past few years as well. So if anybody is driving up prices, it's the profit part of the price equation rather than the wage price of the equation, which is doing it. As a partner in Bain Consultant, he said to corporations, he advises, when times are tough, screw your customers while the screwing is good, he said. The consultant went on, I don't think this is nefarious at all. Companies have a duty to try and raise profits, and that's what the whole system is about. And what we're seeing during this inflation period is a sharp increase in profits relative to wages and even compared to production. And because we have such a low level of productivity in this country, lower than most other major economies, but they're all been slowing down. On this graph, it looks as though South Korea is doing very well productively, but look, it's only 2% a year over the last 5 years. Everybody else is down closer to 1% or even lower, 0.5%. And of course, the UK is nearly down to 0. So if you're not growing, if productivity is not growing, there's no room for the expansion of incomes. So the choice has to be made between where do incomes go, to profits or wages. At the moment, they're going to profits rather than wages at that share of productivity. So workers are being screwed by higher prices and are yet unable to take advantage of what little productivity value added is being created in the economy. Here is a list of the top 10 companies in the UK that have made profits since 2019. And we can see that, as you would expect, the metals companies, basic metals, the energy companies, the oil companies, and so on, but also British American Tobacco, selling its cigarettes and other products around the world, and Tesco's, the biggest store in the world. These are making profits anything between, in the case of Rio Tinto, 13 billion in the last 2 years, a change in their profits margin of 18% during that period, and so on. These companies are getting more and more profit, and they're benefiting from inflation as a result. As I say, the other factor is war. And as the OECD has said, the war has set the global economy on a course of slower growth and rising inflation, a situation not seen since the 1970s. So rising inflation, largely driven by steep increases in the price of energy and food, is causing hardship for low-income people and raising serious food security risks in the world's poorest economies. That's not my statement. That's the statement of the OECD. And the prospects for further growth are even worse. The UK is probably not going to have any growth at all next year. Apart from Russia, it will be the worst growth rate in the whole of the G20. Even the US will be slowing down dramatically. So we have a situation where supply is stagnating, but demand from particularly of spending that's coming out from the capitalists in various areas means that there's a pressure all the time on the price of energy and food. There's a blockage in supply chains and productivity is low. This means inflation is likely to remain sticky and high, even if economies begin to slow. And that's the intention of central banks. They intend now to try and drive up interest rates, keep wages down, and actually provoke a recession in major economies in order to control, as they see it, inflation. And I would say under the capitalist economies, the only way inflation is going to be controlled is through another slump. And that's why I think that we're heading to the position of yet another slump that is going to appear over the next period. A number of questions raised by the organisers for this meeting. We could go through them as you want, but as far as I can see, we have a situation now where it's never been in the interests of workers to have any inflation. Companies like a little bit of inflation, maybe 2 or 3%, because that gives them room to expand profits, to invest a little bit more if they know that prices are rising. There's ever any reason for why workers would want inflation. What they want is no inflation and a steady increase in their incomes, but they're not able to get that. They've never been able to get that. But even in a period of low inflation, workers have always had inflation cutting in to their real income increases. Now we're in the position where there's no real income increases. Remember that figure, that this is the worst situation for 2 decades. This means that by the time we get to the next 2 or 3 years, workers have lost nearly 40% on average of their household income in the UK as a result of inflation and the fact that wages have been held down. No wonder we're in a situation where many workers who, like the leader, as they said recently, we don't like to strike, we seldom strike, where they're forced into the position of making an effort to restore their incomes as best they can. I mean, they've got a long way to go to get back the losses that have taken place since 2008. The start has begun amongst many sectors of the labour movement, as we see through this hot summer in many ways.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think that was really interesting, and you really pointed out sort of the crass inequality going on here. So profits are fine. There's no issue with profits. The big companies are making a mint, and yet we are told we have to, reduce we have to reduce our spending. We shouldn't ask for higher wages. We have to save the economy. It's us. Like we are all to blame for global warming. We are to blame for inflation. It's outrageous. I mean, in terms of how to solve this issue, the Tories are falling over themselves. Tax cuts, no tax cuts. I think that's their solution or not, which is socialism, to cut taxes. Does that even touch the issue, tax cuts?
Absolutely not. I mean, Rishi Sunak was accused of being a socialist because he wanted to keep taxes where they are at the moment. Remember, he's planning to cut corporation tax, not to increase it. He eventually wants to do that. So they're all in favour of tax cuts. But if you don't do them now, apparently you're a socialist. On the other hand, Sunak accused Truss of being a socialist on the grounds that she wanted to spend without any control over government spending. So there you have the two classic positions of if you like, the the Tory party, but also generally of big business and society, that we want no government spending. We want everything to be cut right back. On the other hand, we don't want any taxes either. And that's the policy which they're offering to us to solve the question of inflation. Neither of those policies would solve inflation. But think about it. Let's start at the basics. Where is the inflation coming from? It's coming directly through our energy, mostly. Who is deciding where prices are going up? A bunch of energy companies, half of whom are foreign, but that's probably relevant, state-owned, some of them, are charging huge increases in energy prices. And the energy regulator is doing really absolutely nothing about it, because the regulator says this is the amount of profit that you're entitled to make. And so we're obviously not going to reduce that in any way. So that's why prices have to rise. Well, it seems it's a glaring example. Do you remember that the Labour Party leaders only a few years ago stood for the public ownership of the utilities, including the energy companies? And yet the current leadership is completely taken that out of the equation. And yet here we have a very, very good example for why we need to bring back these energy companies, not just them, of course, but in particular the energy companies, into public ownership and control. We know the answer in front, for example, in France, which is hardly a socialist country. They have a state-owned energy company, EDF, which was 86% owned by the government before this. And the government said you can't raise prices more than 4%. And now they're taking over the other 14% because EDF says, well, we can't afford it if you don't raise prices. So they say, okay, well, we'll take you over and we'll run it as a public service. That is what the Macron government said. Why it is not possible for our own Labour leaders to see the course of action, at least on this area, is just amazing to me when we're faced with crisis.
And it's not exactly a socialist demand, is it? As you quite rightly say, nationalisation of industry. I mean, Royal Bank of Scotland was nationalised. The government can nationalise quite easily. Do you think it's a lack of pressure? Or is it economy, the oil companies?
I can't speak for our own Labour leaders why they don't want to hold to the policy we had a few years ago and have put that manifesto into the trash can only recently. I can't speak for why they want to do that. They obviously seem to think that such a policy will be damaging to Labour's vote or the economy. I can't see how anybody can argue that, really, because all these measures of public ownership of the energy, but not only that, of the utilities in general, are massively popular when they do public opinion. They're massively popular. In fact, I measured the amount of public opinion polls we've had over the last 20 years on the question of nationalisation. And on everyone, renationalisation of the railways, the utilities, even the banks, the renationalisation of there's a majority amongst the British public to bring these into and make them public services and not profit-making operations. Yet, no Labour leader now or anybody has been prepared to back such a policy in any serious way.
In fact, I've looked up the Labour's proposals to solve. They actually say that this is going to solve the cost of living crisis. 4 points: cut VAT on home energy bills, just the VAT. Save on energy bills now by insulating homes in the long term. Cut small business rates and buy, make and sell more in Britain to create well-paid, secure jobs in every community. I mean, this is even
well, you have to say
writing this must have noticed
this is like trying to stop the ocean coming in by using a spoon to throw the water back. It's going to have so little effect on inflation, and none of those measures will have much at all effect on inflation at all. And so really, that is like throwing up your hands and saying there's nothing we can do. We have to turn to the Bank of England to rocket up interest rates, which they will be doing next week again, hitting everybody in their pockets through higher borrowing costs, whether it's mortgage costs and so on, and feeding through the economy to a reduction in investment and consumer spending. In other words, driving the economy towards recession. The UK economy is really weak. It's really in terrible state. The UK pound has collapsed by something like 20% against the US dollar, which means that import prices are rising all the time. And we just cannot argue that the solution to this is to make a small cut in VAT or to help small businesses with their rates and hope that people insulate their houses over the next, I don't know, 20 years, and all these other measures, which even if you introduce them are so long-term, they have no effect at the moment. You need emergency action now to deal with inflation. It cannot be left, and it certainly cannot be left to the Bank of England and other central bankers to decide how to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. Clearly, what is needed is pressure from below, isn't it? And we are seeing the small bits of hopeful actions from the trade union movement, not from the Labour Party, unfortunately. But we are looking at this in this program, and it's clear that there needs to be something happening and putting pressure on the Labour government, on the Labour Party, to actually fight for a decent policy on that issue. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. Bye-bye.
So that tells us the breadth of the problem. It strikes me that we're into a sort of perfect storm sort of situation economically, because nobody is coming up with the answers. And a lot of people have been thinking about the links between the sort of summer of discontent now and the winter of discontent with the miners. And for those of you who have a television, watch a television, you will know that there has been this really interesting series called Sherwood on. It's actually a sort of murder mystery, but it's actually based around the pit villages, and it's about the history and the legacy of what happened in that strike. And Tina was actually able to talk to Harry Paterson about this. He was acting as an advisor on this film. And the question here is, what are the links? Are we into a similar sort of industrial period?
Harry Paterson is the author of Look Back in Anger, the miners' strike in Nottinghamshire, 30 years on, and was also an advisor on the series Sherwood. One of the best things you will have seen, hopefully if you've seen it on the BBC, in many, many years, in my humble opinion. Though I know, Harry, you didn't quite like the truth and reconciliation ending. The series does not just look at the use of spy cops, which is sort of at the heart of the series, but it also makes another important political point that we want to discuss a bit today, which is the deliberate attempt to provoke the miners into a strike. Can you explain this a little bit? What was behind that?
Sure. In 1977, Tory grandee Nicholas Ridley was responsible for authoring a document which became known as the Ridley Report. And here it is. It's effectively a blueprint for the privatisation of the then public services in Britain: coal, steel, rail, British Telecom, docks, the pits, obviously, just about everything you could imagine that was at that time publicly owned. This document laid out how the Conservatives were going to privatise Britain. And it's fascinating. This was 2 years before the advent even of Margaret Thatcher. So it shows, compared to the ruling class that we have at the moment, well, certainly compared to its representatives in government, we were dealing with a completely different order and calibre of class warrior back in those days. These were astute, far-sighted, prescient, and very shrewd and pragmatic class warriors. What's most important is the confidential and secret amendment at the back of the document. Now, what that does is it lays out how the Conservatives and the ruling class should deal with any obstacles to their plan to privatise the country. We should try and provoke a battle in a non-vulnerable industry where we can win. This is what happened when we won against the postal workers in 1971. A victory on ground of our choosing would discourage an attack on more vulnerable grounds. This area is most likely to be coal. Here we should seek to operate with the maximum quantities of stocks possible, particularly at power stations. We should arrange for certain haulage companies to recruit in advance a corps of non-union lorry drivers. Is the frank admission of our masters that they should seek to provoke a strike, and that the most likely battleground would be coal. In 1983, the NUM, having previously made Thatcher just back off a little bit in 1981 when she announced a pit closure programme, seek to reduce stocks of coal and coke at power stations and at pit heads, because they knew that the battle was coming. They were so successful with this that by November 1983, just a few months prior to the start of the Great Miners' Strike, McGregor, who'd been appointed by Thatcher to bust the NUM, having done a similar job for her at British Steel just, a year or two previously, was urgently summoning Thatcher and telling her that if they couldn't provoke the miners into a strike as soon as possible, and they allowed things to drift throughout the spring and into the summer, it would require only a very short strike by the NUM in the winter of 1984 to ground the country and put the lights out. So he said, we need to strike now. We need to bring them into battle while we've still got stocks high. And of course, as history tells us, they then announced the closure of Cortonwood Pit on March the 5th, 1984. And of course, from then on, the strike unfolded. They were provoked, absolutely in outline with the recommendations of the Ridley report, and they were faced with a stark choice. Strike then and perhaps save the industry, or don't strike and guarantee its destruction.
I mean, this is, we need to learn lessons from the past, isn't it? It's hugely important. Do you see something similar happening then today with the RMT strike? I mean, this is one of the most powerful unions there is. There have been now an offer of some 13% pay rise for the lowest wage workers, but it's still linked to, huge changes to working patterns, conditions, and de-staffing stations, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating period, really, because there are some stark parallels, but at the same time, the period is very, very different to that which existed in 1984. So to explain briefly, on the one hand, the representatives of the ruling class today are of an entirely different order to that faced by the NUM back in 1984. Today, of course, they're dealing with clowns. They're dealing with a Z-list front bench that's stuffed with, extremists, fundamentalists and nutters who are only there by virtue of the fact that Boris Johnson wanted unquestioning obedience as he seeked to push Brexit through. So the quality of the enemy is far, far less impressive now than it was then. That's a huge point in our favour, which leads, of course, directly to the second point, that in this instance, there hasn't been any concerted, far-sighted plan by the ruling class to force the RMT, or indeed any section of the working class, into open conflict with it so it can seek to maximise a strategic advantage. These things are purely a result of the objective conditions that have become so severe for elements of our class that the sort of action the RMT are taking now is pretty much inevitable. So I think it's different. It's very different to the period that existed then. And for the same reason, it's produced a slightly different outlook amongst the wider public. The NUM was pretty much isolated in 1984. Of course, there was tremendous support from individual elements of the labour movement and from individual branches and so forth. But that was pretty much it. Nobody else came out on solidarity strike with them. Indeed, Eric Hammond of the far-right WETPU union at the time actually instructed his members to scab and cross NUM picket lines. And the TUC, of course, took no action. Today, the RMT, I think, have inspired, barristers, cleaners, bus drivers. There's a whole slew of organised labour across many sections of industry coming out on strike and seeking to, strike a blow in defence of their terms and conditions. That's very different from 1984. And whilst these are very tentative and early shoots at the moment, I think there's a degree of optimism that we should allow ourselves, which didn't necessarily exist in the former period.
It was interesting you say that it's actually the RMT strike seems to be more popular. I thought it was the other way around. The miners' strike was, you put a bucket out and you had loads of people throwing their money in, etc. I mean, is that how it developed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point, but I think the popularity that the NUM deservedly won was confined really to the more advanced sections of the working class and its organised expressions. Today, of course, there's almost a grudging admiration for Mick Lynch in particular and the RMT in general amongst some bourgeois liberal commentators. And certainly the wider public are far more instinctively inclined to see the merits of the RMT's case and instinctively side with it than was the case, I would suggest, in 1984.
And it's probably because we're all feeling the pinch, aren't we? It is affecting everybody. And if they can win and fight, you know, perhaps there's hope for all of us. So the NUM was still is affiliated to the Labour Party. Do you think that was an advantage during the miners' strike, a disadvantage, or did it not matter at all?
I suppose there was some small propaganda advantage in them being so affiliated, because at least it allowed Arthur Scargill and the other leaders of the NUM access to Labour Party conference and Labour Party forums, where they were able to demonstrate and explain articulately and clearly their case to the wider Labour movement. Admittedly, it produced nothing in terms of any sort of effective solidarity from the Labour leadership, but it certainly produced a huge grassroots swell of support amongst constituency Labour parties and local officials at a regional level.
How do you see the relationship of the Labour Party with the trade unions today?
Well, it's just absolutely, it's disgraceful, isn't it? You know, we've got a Labour Party leader. I mean, there's a clue in the name there. One would have thought Labour actually instructing his MPs on pain of discipline not to stand on picket lines. He's a very, very good example of what Lenin spoke about when he likened the Labour Party to a bourgeois Labour formation, that it may comprise an element of the working class, but its leaders are thoroughly bourgeois and seek to operate strictly in the interests of that class. Starmer's not even making any pretense that he's doing anything other than that. He couldn't be more establishment if he tried. So, you know, in '84 at least, Kinnock was appalling. His conduct, toward, you know, and his attitude towards the dispute was dreadful. But he still even then had to try and couch his criticisms of the NUM and Arthur Scargill in such a way as to at least give some sort of veneer, paid some sort of lip service to the fact that this was the political wing of organised Labour. Starmer, of course, now has no such concerns and indeed makes no such pretense.
So where do you think this is, I mean, is there logic developing? You know, I mean, there's increasing trade union struggles, economic hardship for many, many people. I mean, something has to happen. Do you have any prediction what's going to happen if it's not reflected in the Labour Party?
Well, I think people making predictions as to where this is going to go are extremely brave. I think a couple of things are not going to happen. I don't think there's going to be another surge of the grassroots Labour left that's going to capture the leadership and swing things back towards a pro-working class party that we enjoyed very briefly and very partially under Jeremy Corbyn. That isn't happening.
That avenue has been closed by the...
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the only area I do feel particularly confident in predicting is that I think the Labour Party historically now is a complete dead end and is unlikely to be revived as any sort of forum for class struggle. The nomination process has been changed for leaders, so the chances of getting a left MP on the ballot are slim to vanishing. The Socialist Campaign Group has proved itself to be completely and utterly ineffective. And at its worst expression, people like John McDonnell are frankly just backing down, you know, as soon as Starmer even glances fairly sternly in their direction. So the Labour Party is over. And I think that's a good thing. Historically, it's been a barrier and an obstacle. Anybody with a proper Marxist analysis of these formations should only ever have approached the Labour Party as a purely tactical, you know, arena in which to work from time to time. Anybody approaching it, you know, with this hard and fixed dogmatic view that it is the expression of organised Labour and change can only come through via the Labour movement is objectively impeding the struggle of the Labour movement.
Thank you very much, Harry. Lots of issues in there that perhaps some of us might disagree with or agree with. We're going to talk to a few trade unionists now about some of these issues. This will not be the end. We're going to have another show next week where people from the floor can get involved, because I think this is goes to the heart of what we're doing at the moment and how we're organizing inside Labour, outside Labour, etc. So, you know, the arena of the class struggle, etc. So hi, Pete Furman. Thank you for joining us. Pete Furman is a member of the CW, the Communication Workers Union, and the Trade Union Officer for the Labour Representation Committee. Now, before we go into what Harry's been saying about Labour, etc., we would like to ask you about the CWU strike, which is one of the strikes that have been going on recently, and perhaps taken courage from the RMT, or perhaps it's totally independent. But how is that going? Are we heading towards a general strike?
Well, in response to the thing about CWU first, there's different CWU disputes. One section of CWU members in the Crown Post Office has already been on strike 6 days. The BT workers had a massive vote for strike action in their ballot, and they've already named 2 days of strike action, and that's 40,000 workers in BT. The Royal Mail ballot, your posties, the result of that ballot gets announced tomorrow, and I would be very surprised if that's not an overwhelming vote for strike action. That's 115,000 members. So that's the state of the CW ballots and strike action. I don't think we're going to see a general strike, although never say never. But what we are seeing is an element of coordinated strike action. So, for instance, on rail, where you've got RMT and ASLEF have both announced dates. They're not the same date, but they are in the same week, which means that the rail network be screwed up for the whole of that week. And there is certainly elements of coordination going on. That's not the same as general strike. I mean, a general strike would not just mean that people are out the same day and indefinitely, but also that the biggest battalions like Unison and Unite were part of that. The Unite has had several smallish disputes around things like refuse workers and some bus companies, but the big battalions in Unite, like London Bus and so on, haven't yet even been balloted, let alone coming into battle. The other thing about, and Unison had an attempt at the ballot in local government, which fell completely flat, and quite honestly, achieving the barriers that the government has created for ballots, achieving that in the health service is pretty nigh impossible. So, there are those hurdles, and there is absolutely no sign, despite talk from some, of trade union leaders defying the trade union laws. So, I mean, for instance, as part of the RMT ballots, with the overwhelming votes for strike action in many train operating companies, on Thameslink, they fell, I think, 5 votes short of the barrier for taking strike action. There was not a thought of, well, we'll take the strike action anyway. In Royal Mail, it was clear months ago that Royal Mail wasn't going to give a decent pay increase, and they were demanding all sorts of concessions on terms and conditions. Despite the fact it became obvious months ago, the union still went through a 3-month mediation period before balloting on strike action. So there's still, although there's an element of coordination and lots of different sectors coming into battle, if you like, there is also still that moderate attitude towards what you can and you can't do.
Yeah, it has been a bit of a discussion there in the chat now, which the left should demand a general strike now. I mean, what are the dangers or prospects of a general strike without a party of the organized working class there to cohere and reflect that?
Well, I mean, the 1926 general strike, the Labour Party didn't call it. Although I would argue that we would want the politicians to support and to encourage, it is really end of the day down to the unions whether they call a general strike or not. Even with a Labour Party under somebody like Jeremy Corbyn whatever, it would still be down to the unions whether they call a general strike. I mean, it's 50 years now since the Pentonville Five were released from jail. The response there was entirely from the unions. I don't think the Labour Party came out at the time opposing it. It just was silent, basically. So, while we would want, some of us would want the Labour Party to be speaking up in support and so on, it's not entirely down to them.
No, you've heard Harry Paterson talking about, the Labour Party is dead, and we are now, I was quite slightly puzzled. We're now in a better position than, we were in the 80s with the Great Miners' Strike, because our enemy is so weak, but then so are we, aren't we? I mean, how do you see that? Are we in a better position?
The union movement as a whole is much weaker than it was in 84, 85. Union membership is much smaller and only just coming out of a period where, there were very, very low strike statistics going back, to the lowest since unions formed, basically. We're only just coming out of that. In terms of sort of the government being sort of made up of clowns and that, which is of course true, but they're still clowns who've got that class consciousness. They're all saying they're the heir to Thatcher and so on. And the other thing is, they have with no problem at all, they got through Parliament their agency workers bill about changing the law so that employers can now use agency workers to break strikes and so on. So it's not as straightforward, I think, as was said about the Sherwood thing, both in terms of our strength and in terms of the ruling class's strength. I mean, the ruling class beyond the government, the ruling class as in employers, I certainly wouldn't say they were weaker than they were in 84, 85. If you look at the way they've enriched themselves, the way they've managed to get the gig economy widely, 4 million workers and so on, I don't think the ruling class is weaker overall.
No, and Labour, I mean, I do agree with Harry's assessment that, Labour, as Lenin called it, a bourgeois workers' party. It's got a bourgeois pole and a workers' pole who are always in, it's always a class war going on in the Labour Party, isn't there? And so Keir Starmer is not the only Labour leader who's turned his back on striking workers in the history of our movement, has he?
But it's not even just striking workers. I mean, Blair was proud of the fact that we had the from our point of view, worst, from his point of view, best anti-union laws in Europe. But it's also, this is, as you say, it's sort of, there's always a battle there. It's not just the unions formed the Labour Party, but they actually formed it in response to the Taffel judgment, which basically criminalised unions, which basically said that union leaders would have to pay damages for any strike action. And we're actually almost back to that position because the Tories changed the law not long ago to increase the fines for unions, large unions, up to possible £1 million. So, there's all those barriers. I mean, but the union attitude, the Labour Party attitude has varied. You've had, after the 74 election, Labour conceded the miners' demands. And there's been lots of Labour members, Labour MPs in these strikes, joining picket lines, supporting them, and so on. So it's mixed in that respect. But Starmer is hardly alone in being a shit on questions of strike action and unions. But it's a battle in terms of the Labour Party's dead. I would unravel that. Even if you think that the Labour Party. Well, even if you think the Labour Party was a vehicle for socialism, which I never did, it was always a battleground. But the other thing is not dead in the sense of it doesn't go away just because you don't like it. It's still there. It's still a hurdle that most working class people, like it or not, will vote for, that the best unions are affiliated to. In terms of closing off the barriers to your new leadership, obviously at the moment that's true. But you also can't rule out, when we're talking about union militancy, that some unions that aren't currently on the left might change their attitude and might reverse some of those changes. And don't forget, even unions like the GMB refused last Labour Party conference to go along with the proposed changes in electoral college. Now, they went along with the rule change on nominations, and that is there, and that is at the moment a complete barrier to a left candidate. But there's no saying that can't be reversed by a revolt with the unions.
It is getting increasingly difficult, of course, for members at least. It certainly is at the moment.
I'm not saying it's not difficult. I'm just saying we should never say never.
Yeah, I guess as long as the unions are still affiliated to the Labour Party. I mean, that brings me to my last question. I mean, the RMT is, of course, not affiliated to the Labour Party. It is at the moment the most, inspiring dispute, perhaps. Do you think it would make a real difference to the current struggle if it were affiliated? Would it be able to put pressure on Labour and move it to the left, make a difference there?
Well, it's putting pressure on Labour anyway. I don't think certainly Starmer's attitude wouldn't be any difference whether it's an affiliated union or not. I mean, obviously, having more unions in there that are on the left and so on would help, but I don't think Starmer cares either way. I mean, the only time Starmer would start caring is if it was one of the big unions like United or Unison or GMB. But the other thing is, I mean, I was at Tolpuddle the weekend, and it was interesting what Mick Lynch said about the Labour Party in speech there, which was that while the RMT isn't affiliated to the Labour Party at the moment, and he's got no wish for it to be, he is in favour of pressuring the Labour Party to support the strikes and calling on Labour MPs to do so, and he has no interest in another party, was his words. It might be a useful point Dave Ward, General Secretary of CWU, wrote in Morning Star, and it's quite interesting because he says that we need to build our strength to a point where you can force the direction that Labour goes in, or if it really gets to a point where we don't see any possibility of that, we've already built something here and it's strong enough and maybe we can go in a different direction. So it's basically saying, these fights have to happen now and we demand that Labour supports us if we reach a point where unions together, and that's another point, it's not a matter of unions peeling off one by one, unions together decide that the Labour Party is no longer their vehicle, a useful vehicle for them, then that's a big step. And that's what he's implying, but he's not saying we walk away now.
Yeah, I mean, Unite's position, the new position under Sharon Graham, is interesting in that aspect as well, because she's not threatening disaffiliation, but she certainly says we have to vary the way we exercise pressure. I mean, do you see a sort of, do you see a tension there between syndicalism and, which is a problem as well, isn't it? If the unions don't engage with politics, but that's probably not happening with Unite, or is it in your view? Where's Unite going with its?
I'm not entirely sure, but the impression I think a lot of us get is that her attitude, I don't know about their national executive, but her attitude is sort of, well, I'm not going to get involved in Labour Party internal fights, sort of, I'll concentrate on the industrial. Now, on one level, I'm pleased that they're winning industrial fights and taking that seriously. But on another level, she needs, along with the other unions, to be demanding that Labour should support their fights and that Labour shouldn't be witch hunting their members, which it's doing, and those issues. So and whether she likes it or not, what happens in the Labour Party does affect what happens in their industrial struggles. You can't escape it just by sort of saying, well, we don't want to get involved.
So I guess the answer is always inside Parliament, outside Parliament, inside the Labour Party, outside the Labour Party, inside unions, outside unions. I think we have to bring those struggles together. Thank you very much for joining us.
Just one last thing on that inside outside. I mean, however wonderful your party was, however big a majority it had in Parliament, the struggle isn't just in Parliament, because employers, army, etc., put up resistance. So it's not simply a question of, you know, the parliamentary struggle or the extra parliamentary struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay with us, Pete, if you can, because we're talking to a few other comrades now. And we're actually going to show that clip, parts of that clip you were mentioning of Mick Lynch, because it is interesting from Tulpuddle.
And I think that the New Deal for workers that some of us are promoting has got to lead to the trade union movement taking the union flag, which is different to the Labour Party's flag, and planting it in every community, every city, town, village and community in this country, and saying, we are the working class, we are the trade unions, and we are here and we're going to make a difference, whether the politicians like it or not. And when we do that job of winning cases, winning campaigns, winning struggles and winning fights, and putting our values back into working class communities, where frankly some people are lost. They don't know what to believe in. So last time they voted Tory, and next time we don't know what they're going to vote. If we put the trade union flag in those communities, the politicians in the Labour Party, and maybe in the SNP or whatever else is around, will have to move to our positions, because the people will have gone there before them. And I think that's what we're experiencing at the minute. The people are ready for a change, many of them. We've got to fertilise that change, if that's not a horrible expression. But we've got to make that change happen in their minds and in their activities that they do. And then the reluctant people in our movement, the other side of it, the elected politicians, will have to come to where the trade unions are. So now is the time where the trade unions must lead. It's not going to be done by anyone else. We can't hope for a legislative programme that's going to restore us to our position that we had in the past. It's going to be our campaigning, our work, our members, our struggles that will lead the way, and the legislation will follow later, when hopefully the Labour Party wins that election and delivers what working class people need and what this trade union movement needs.
So there you have it, Mick Lynch, straight from the horse's mouth. And of course the RMT have been very pivotal in this point of unrest. And we're very pleased to have with us Glenroy Watson, former president of the RMT's London Transport Regional Council and vice chair of the Finsbury Park RMT branch, which is actually the largest branch in the London service. Hello, Glenroy, how are you doing?
Yes, greetings. Finsbury Park is the largest traffic branch. That means we deal with station trains. Some of our other branch engineers are larger than Finsbury Park branch, which is a small point.
Thank you for correcting me on that. But in terms of what's happening at the moment, the industrial scene, Labour isn't doing it, so the unions are having to do it, or the unions should be doing it. Where do you stand on that one?
Well, we've been here before, but before I say that, could I just put something in the miners' discussion? Because, you know, I lived through it, and I don't remember. Yes, there was solidarity, but there was also a lot of opposition with people going around wearing paper bags and secret attacks against the union, invasions of spies and what have you. So we need to remember the challenge against them. But the comrade who spoke earlier on, we're in a different situation. In 1989, we responded as a trade union, an RMT, and many, many others joined in that dispute when we started from a point of unofficial dispute from a number of trade unions on the underground, or trade unionists. So we've been there, we're here again. And the reality is that for us on the underground, this hasn't been a financial motivation. It is about actually trying to steal our pension and cut our staff, reduce colleagues in a safety environment, you know, and that for us is a very crucial thing. On the railway, there is another dispute, obviously, and I want to talk about that in a moment. But on the underground, we have four disputes going at the moment. Lots of people are not aware of it. We have the night tube, which is largely forgotten about because they've tried to say everyone should do night tube, which means that instead of, you know, you choosing your shift and you want to do early, late turn, you're supposed to do all night Friday and Saturday night. So we're in dispute about that. We're still picketing on a Friday and a Saturday. We also have the cleaners dispute, and it was interesting to hear what Mick says, and we're going to hold him to that, because the cleaners have been neglected for a long time. They have been basically sold like chattel enslavement to disreputable companies. You know, used to have about 4 or 5 at one point. It's now down to 1 ABM, a bunch of cheap crooks. And the mayor of London have renewed their contract. Well, that's another story as well, because it turned out it wasn't the mayor that agreed. It was a financial department that actually says that they should hand over £450 million to ABM. And that has to be challenged. Our pension is obviously sacrosanct. And I think, you know, thinking about whether somebody is provoking a dispute or not, it's interesting to do that analysis, because surely no government could expect to get away with that. They're trying to say it was the mayor's idea. So we want to actually examine that it was his coders, if you like, telling the Treasury that he could change our pension fund to his benefit. And of course, when you get rid of 600 staff in a safety environment that we need people when there is an emergency, you're basically risking people's life. But there's a knock-on effect in the sense of also contributing to the pension fund. 600 people not contributing to the pension fund will have an impact on the pension fund. Now, our pension fund is in a very good state. We actually forced the management to pay back some money that they had stolen, because during the 90s, where there was a fairly good payment for the pension, we had a surplus. They actually took a pension holiday. You know, when we are asking to improve pensioners' benefit, they said, no, we're going to have a pension holiday. Now, we've taken them to court and they've had to pay that back. So there's money within the pension fund. There's absolutely no reason for this running around and trying to change it. Change it to what? There's a number of options on the table, and they've not indicated which one they're willing to try. One, of course, being leave it alone.
So there's generally a sense I'm getting from you is that this disputation, which is a series of things, is actually something that the government, the bosses, are quite happy to be with. So what's happening with the staff at the moment? What's the sense of solidarity amongst the staff?
Well, the sense of solidarity is we certainly want to link up with others. We've linked up, as you know, with the main line, and we want to continue that. Comrade has said ASLEF have called dates, and it will sink in with our dates, but it would have been, I think, more progressive, certainly on the underground, where if they'd utilized their strike. But on the main line, what they've called is, I think, very useful and very effective, and we will certainly be acting in solidarity with that. The workforce, I think, is on a very good mood. They actually feel that this is something that we must win, especially on the pension. There is no way that is ever going to be allowed to slip away. In saying that, just a word of warning, because Comrade mentioned Thames Link and the ballot result there. It is a challenge. It is a challenge. 5,000 of our members didn't get their ballot back in time, but we managed to beat the threshold. But it is a challenge. Yeah. You know, it has to be recognized that these were put there not as some haphazard figure. They had checked all the ballot paper from various unions and sought to create a margin.
Yes.
And this isn't just, you know, 51% isn't something that is plucked out of a hat. They've done research.
Yes.
And we have to up the game. And if we don't, and there have been times that we've lost the threshold, I mentioned the cleaners dispute. The cleaners dispute was lost by 11 votes when we last balloted it.
It strikes me as well that, I mean, I don't know, this is the question I want to ask you. I mean, living in London myself, it feels to me that there is quite a bit of public support for the workers in the underground. There's quite a lot of sympathy there. How do you feel the public mood is at the moment in terms of the ideas of strike action?
I think it's excellent. You know, we've had people come on the picket line and tell us they understand, even though they've just come off a packed bus or trying to get to another bus, and understand. I think that it's a crazy situation where people have basically, after lockdown, believe that somehow things will change. I've got a poster outside my window. It's been there since the start of the so-called pandemic that says, let's make sure we unite and don't go back to where it was before. And I think people, you know, I think that generally across the country, people believe that this is the time that we must have change. You know, and when you hear about how other people are getting, thanks to the report on the finance, how many people are getting rich, and then after, for our first demand for a pay, now we've had a 5-year pay agreement, so the underground was all like protected from it, but next year we have to start that process again. But on the main line, obviously they'd been denied a pay rise. And now COVID is supposed to be over or receded. Are you serious? You're telling us we can't get a pay rise after all of that period of time, whilst the tops are getting rich, while the CEO are pocketing money that government have been paying in there? You know, it's as if they don't think we know that these things are happening. And therefore, we are demanding that the cost of living that's impacting on our members on the main line is challenged and something done about it. And we're not going to let that go. Their response to the demand for improvement in pay is to threaten job cuts and so-called modernization, going around as they did with the underground, saying how many tickets are sold in tube station, train station, as if staff in the ticket office don't do anything else. They're there for emergency. They're the one who meet the emergency unit when they come. So to suggest, and they're getting away with it, I think the public largely is in support of our strike, but we haven't done enough to explain the machination that's going on, the lies that are being told. You know, Mick Lynch had to tell somebody quite a few times. I think people have seen that clip, how many times that they're lying. And that's what the government are doing. Never mind who's going to change and who's going to be here.
What do you think the position in terms of affiliation to the Labour Party should be?
Well, you know, far be it for me to disagree with my leader, but I've read many things into what was said. I've stood for Tusk. Somebody asked if we're disaffiliated. Apparently we have. How it was done was rather extraordinary. But you see, for me, we have broken with the Labour Party. The Labour Party broke with us. You know, people forget the history. What had actually happened was we supported an independent political party, and the Labour Party say you can't do that, and we were kicked out of the Labour Party. So a lot of people say we're disaffiliated. Yes, we've maintained that position. We haven't asked to come back. But the reality is that we were kicked out. Now, as far as I'm judging the General Secretary's speech, is he saying that we should build an alternative to the Labour Party, or even something to challenge the Labour Party? At the moment, we do very well with our selection of MPs inside the Labour Party who lobby for us. But the reality is that when Bob Crow was there, I think we had a bigger and better dynamics relationship with his MPs. I've not seen a report from any of them for a long time. Now, these include John McDonnell and Jeremy and people like that, but what are they doing? What have they been doing lately? I hope Jeremy is always on our picket line, so there's no question about that. I'm pretty sure I've seen a picture. John McDonnell was also on the picket line. It will be interesting to know what more they can do to people that they already punished who did come on the picket line. A lot of people in the House of Lords, by the way, of all places, were on the picket line. One was in Brixton, another one I think was in mainline picket line. So many of the people within the party have completely ignored what Stormer has said, and rightly so. You know, so I think that we're in a situation where even the issue of our list of MP, how does this relate to where we are within the party? Now, if you're going to break away from Tusk, which is what the General Secretary moved at the AGM and that was passed, what is the alternative? Simply our list of MP? Are we going to end up re-affiliating to the Labour Party? That's my suspicion, because what has happened is in the local election recently, we were told that we can support Labour Party candidate regardless. And if we wanted to support anybody else, i.e. Tusk, we had to write into head office, and we didn't get an answer back from head office until the day of the election. So that doesn't strike me as support. And therefore, the idea that suddenly we disaffiliated, as somebody's put in the chat, from Tusk, I think that's a reality, and probably not just since the annual general meeting. It's probably been going on for some time. But I think it's a question we have to ask within the RMT, what is the alternative? You know, is the alternative where we make donation to a list of MP who aren't allowed to come and support us, aren't allowed to stand up? The whole idea of the list of MP is so that they will speak on our behalf in Parliament, you know? And with all due respect to what's happening with Jeremy and John, where is it? What are we getting for that?
On that note, Glenroy, thank you very much. That is the question. I mean, you know, if you're going to affiliate to a party, what should you get? What should the relationship be between Labour and the trade unions? But just stay there, because I think we're going to continue this discussion. Tina.
Thanks, Glenroy. That's interesting, actually, that there's a move to get the RMT perhaps re-affiliated to Labour. That's interesting to watch. We're going to have a quick chat with Deepa Driver, who is a legal observer of the Assange case, where most comrades know her from. She's been very involved in that for socialist lawyers. And she's also a member of the National Executive Committee of the UCU, the University and Lecturer Union, where she's a national negotiator for pay and conditions and pensions. You're quite busy with that role, I presume, in the current climate. So could you give us an update about the struggle in the UCU at the moment?
Sure, Tina. If I may, I just want to make a small modification to the introduction to say it's the University and College Union rather than, and we represent librarians, professional admin staff, lecturers, researchers. So it's across FE, further education and higher education. So firstly, it's nice to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. I guess your question is, where are we in terms of our disputes? I'm happy to let you know that 22 out of 25 of our further education branches have today reported that they've beaten the Tory anti-trade union threshold.
Wow.
25 out of 25 have got a solid yes mandate over the 75% threshold. 3 of them didn't make the 50% threshold. So if you know what I mean. So solidarity to our further education colleagues. We have some disputes which are ongoing. For example, at Queen Mary's, management is behaving in an appalling way towards our staff, including, trying to strike break in so many ways, trying to take away people's salary so if you don't do marking, they're taking away 100% of your salary. And it's a very aggressive approach that many institutions, not just Queen Mary, we have another dispute on, which is live at Goldsmiths, where there are so many redundancies at Wolverhampton, at Roehampton. So there are lots of local disputes as well. And then we will have ballots coming up in the months of September, August, September-ish, into early October, potentially, depending on what dates are announced to the employers. And these ballots will be about pay and conditions. And it's just awful. Employers have given so little this year. They've essentially goaded us to a point where they say they recognize that there is inflation around us, but they're unwilling to make any movement, which is just disgusting, actually, because if they really care about the conditions of our colleagues, they won't let so many of our comrades be on such terrible contracts that people have been casualized for 14, 15 years. I mean, that's a shame for the trade union movement, that people who are, I know of one particular FE colleague who was actually living in a hostel because she could not afford the fare to come into work at peak time. So, we are having people who are supposedly in very cushy jobs actually living quite difficult lives. Lots of our colleagues struggling with paying the bills, paying for heating, paying for food. On the pension side, I was quite interested to hear Glenroy talk about the payment holiday that his employers took some time ago. But we had similar behavior with our employers. And a few months ago in April, I'm very sad to say, we had a 40% cut to our pension. And it was pushed through on the basis of a lie. And we've looked at the data before and after, and the scheme is in exceedingly good health. It has moved from £66.5 billion to £90 billion during the course of the pandemic. And yet, with using the chair's casting vote, the chair has always, the so-called independent chair has always voted with employers. They pushed through these 40% cuts, and they said to us, oh, well, if we get the details of the valuation a little later, I mean, I won't go into the details of that, things would be moved back. And now they're playing very hard to get on that. So firstly, it's very important that we resist, and we resist hard. It's very important that you take strike action at the right time and don't just let it go and wait for things to get worse, because actually you can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, as some of our previous campaigns have shown. I'll stop there, but because I can prattle on about TCU for a while. But
I was going to ask you something, because the attack on pensions, I think that's been going on for some time, isn't it? And the turnout, as far as I can tell, was always pretty solid. It was, you've seen them in Sheffield, where I am. It was, there was good picket lines on all the entrances, etc. Do you think is there a movement towards, in your view, listening to the other comrades discussing the strikes as well, or is there a point in going towards a general strike? Is that something that's on the cards at the moment, and is it something we should campaign for? Which is, in the chat, there's a lot of talk about that.
Well, I mean, I guess in some ways, I might disagree with a lot of comrades here about the purpose of a general strike, because what are we trying to achieve? When we look at the political landscape, you have a choice between two sets of Tories, one pretending to be Labour and the other pretending to be, saying they are Tories and willing to admit it. Keir Starmer's Labour is a shame. It's a travesty. They shouldn't be called Labour. Keir Starmer should step down. So should people like David Lammy, who should be ashamed that, they're taking the position. As a Black woman, I'm ashamed of these people, because they pretend to stand for us and they're undermining us at every turn. We should be ashamed of what is her name, Birmingham Yardley MP.
Yes, Phillips.
That's the one. I mean, vile, absolutely vile in the way they reacted to Jeremy, in the way she's behaved since. And these are the people who are croning about with the Tories. So having a general strike, what does it deliver us? A choice between two sets of Tories. And right now, I think the trade union movement should be focusing on getting people on the picket lines, focusing on political education, focusing on getting, in my opinion, and this is a personal opinion, it's not a UCA position, getting Jeremy back to take leadership of Labour, because I think he's the one figure that is identifiable by the general public. There are lots of good people in Labour across various parts of the movement, but I think Jeremy Corbyn is the one unifying figure, because he's the one hated figure so far for some on the right. And I think it will.
How would he be taking back control of Labour, you think, or leadership of Labour? It's a bit difficult, isn't it? He's not even got
I don't think he should go. I don't think he should try personally. I don't think we should try and rebuild within the Labour Party as it currently stands, because essentially they are creating rules that prevent any victory. So I know of comrades who worked hard to go through the councillor training provided, for example, by Momentum, and went through the various stages only to be kicked out. And a lot of people, good people, have been excluded from the party. What is the point of all these people? I mean, I can understand that many of them have been in the Labour Party for 50, 60 years, and this is their community. Why should they give it up for these cuckoos? But on the other hand, there is a time when we have to recognize that if young people lose hope, which is what, Jeremy helped young people have hope that there could be an alternative, which is why 14 million people got behind him. And at the moment, a lot of young people have no hope. People have no future to look to other than two bad futures. And people begin to believe, like they did in the Blairite years, that there are never any options possible. And Jeremy's only getting older. It's time to bring him back. It's time for the left to stop bickering and to stop saying, oh, Jeremy did this and Jeremy did that and Jeremy wasn't good enough at this. Yes, we know he didn't speak up for people like Chris or Jackie enough as he should have done, or Mark. But these people, we all need to get behind a recognizable figure who can get elected in the next general election. We all need to convince Jeremy to stand and to say that we need him to take us to where we had originally planned to go. And maybe, having seen what he's done and gone through the pain and hardship of what he's gone through, hopefully he will have a team of advisors who will recognize how much we've been sabotaged by the Labour Party. And we continue to be sabotaged by them. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Deepa. I think the main issue is he's not interested. I can't see it happening, but there's also some issues with it. But thank you for your assessment. And I think we're going to have a time for Pete and the other comrades to come back to that if they wish. Before that, though, we got Comrade Mike Cowley, and sorry, that's the noise coming from his audio a little bit. There is some kind of slight background noise there. Jackie.
Thanks. Hi, Mike.
Mike, you need to have this your earphones plugged in. Is that maybe the issue? Slightly.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
We can hear you. Okay. I think it's slightly better.
I can hear you. Okay. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself, please, in terms of your position?
Yeah, I'm a lecturer at Edinburgh College. So solidarity to Deepa. I know she takes part in organising college lecturers as well down south, and I'm a shop steward at Edinburgh College, and I sit on my union's national committee. My union is the Further Education Lecturers Association, so that's amalgamated with the EIS, which is the biggest teaching union in Scotland.
Right. So, we've been very kind of England-centric, haven't we, the way we've been discussing many of these things. How different, or is there any difference between what's happening in Scotland?
It was interesting to listen to Mick Lynch's contribution from Tolpaddle the other day, and there was a brief allusion to the SNP, and I should say, and it's an allusion that I think some of the left south of the border are still unfortunately mired in. The SNP are by no means a progressive, never mind a class-based organisation up here, and they are explicitly hostile towards the trade union movement. They try and frame themselves in progressive and social democratic ways. But they've been in power since 2008. They've had three separate governments, and they're using the rhetoric of the Tories right now. We had the spectacle of an SNP minister advising public sector workers to tighten their belts recently and to say that there was no magic money tree in Scotland. So the same dynamics, the politics are different up here. We have a devolved parliament. Much of the politics is channeled through those devolved areas. And we have a nationalist party in office who attempt to frame themselves as a progressive and social democratic organisation and have been strategically successful at winning votes from the Labour Party in that sense. But in practice, their record, if we take education, there are appalling educational inequalities in Scotland, and they have not been addressed for the last 15, 20 years.
So I'm presuming, are you having the same kind of level of disputes going on in Scotland?
Yeah, I was on a CWU picket line the other day, bringing our solidarity greetings. There was an individual post office in Edinburgh that was on strike. I know many colleagues in the CWU and other unions. Like many people here, I'm sure I've been active for many decades, so I've got many comrades across the movement. Whether there is the same, the problem up here, Jackie, is that politics is submerged up here in the constitutional debate. Everything is refracted through the constitutional question. What does this mean for the union? What does it mean for independence? But I'm optimistic, as many people on the left are up here, that the rising tide of militancy is going to make it very difficult for the Tories on the one hand and the SNP on the other to articulate that militancy in a way that is compatible with the constitutional question. It just doesn't fit. Issues of basic terms, conditions, income, basic class questions are simply not compatible with the politics that the SNP and the Tory want to have a debate on. They're desperate to narrow the debate and be very effective at doing that.
So what's the position then with Labour in Scotland? I mean, we've already had an interesting, conversation here about, where is Labour in all this? How does it fit? Deeper is suggesting that what we need is a revival of Jeremy Corbyn in terms of coming back and showing some leadership. What about the Labour Party in Scotland?
It is as right-wing as the Labour Party is around the rest of the UK. Anna Sarwar is from the Progress right wing, but interestingly, and I suspect only from a strategic point of view, in terms of outmanoeuvring the SNP, he was on picket lines up here, in contradiction to Starmer's guidelines. So that doesn't suggest a different politics by any means. It just suggests that the Scottish political environment is different, and Sarwar sees the merits on appearing on picket lines, even if he doesn't necessarily support the trade union movement in that sense. He the same difficulties pertain up here, whether it's Blair, Starmer, or the vast majority of Labour leaders throughout history. They have always attempted to sever that relationship between the wider trade union movement and CLPs and the parliamentary party. They don't want to be directly accountable. They don't want the grassroots leveraging pressure on them. They want to live in a parliamentary bubble where there is no pressure, there's no accountability. And Sarwar is no different in that sense. They desperately want to sever that relationship beyond, a basic institutional relationship. But this is my big question, I guess, Jackie, to comrades who were here last week at the show last week, and those who are making similar comments today. And I understand people's frustration. I've been a member of the Labour Party for almost 40 years. I share that frustration. But the politics of that relationship with the trade union movement are, as Sharon Graham said the other day, following David Lammy's comments, at an all-time low. That they're an appalling state of affairs at the moment. The Starmer isn't even strategically functional, because this is a popular dispute and a series of popular disputes from which a political party with its head on could develop and adapt a narrative from. So they're not only hostile to the trade union movement, they don't even see a narrative, a political narrative, when it presents itself. But that politics, as we know, is contingent on the class struggle at any one point. If the class are feeling confident, assertive, if they're mobilising, those politics with the Labour Party change. That's very fluid. What isn't fluid, and this is the elephant, unfortunately, in the room, is this formal institutional link with the trade union movement. Now, what do we do with that? It is an objective reality, and it's not something we can easily bypass. If we are saying, look, it was always, because that's why socialists joined the party, as we know. There are other reasons, but the key reason was this institutional link. Now, if we are no longer making that case, well, we need an alternative case. Where are we going to find a political expression of working class militancy? If we continue to accept that that is a gravitational pull to socialists to join the Labour Party, then how do we shift the party? Unfortunately, that question is still an open question for me.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think that was a very good way to bring it back. And I think we want to open it up quickly now to the other speakers if they want to reply to anything. Just in general, though, I think Mike made some good points there about the fluidity of this question, and the issue that the Labour Party is an arena of the class struggle. As long as the unions are affiliated, and as long as we have the electoral system as it is, I would argue, which makes it very, very difficult for a party outside of Labour to grow and to take hold. Now you could, some argue we should disaffiliate, should call for the unions to disaffiliate and do it that way. Others might argue that actually all unions, all organizations of the working class should try and join the Labour Party and push it to the left that way. It is a question that at the moment that doesn't look very likely. But we should keep in mind the electoral system as well. So I'm going to bring people back in the same order that they spoke earlier, because Pete hasn't spoken in a long time. Would you like to reply to a few things there?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. I mean, it's a discussion that's, it's not a new discussion about this whole question of the Labour Party, do we need a new party and so on. But sometimes it feels like wishful thinking. So we can all sit here and say, well, Jeremy should do X, Y, and Z. And we know that Jeremy's not going to do X, Y, and Z. He may stand as an independent if they prevent him standing. That's about it. I mean, he would get lots of support from all of us here, I expect, if he stood. But Jeremy's not going to call for a new party. But that seems to me like sort of, one of the problems we had was everybody, well, say everybody, that's not true, everybody. Lots of people who came into the party when Jeremy was elected leader took the attitude of, well, we've elected him leader, that's it, job done. And of course it wasn't job done. And sort of there's a sort of feeling of that when people talk about, well, if Jeremy formed a new party, it's not just down to, one person, however wonderful they may or may not be. It's a question of moving to the class. And I mean, a new party without a solid basis in the working class is not going to be any use to us. So I think we have to argue for our unions to take the battle to Starmer. And if they, if we get to the point where, there's clearly nothing, no shift, then the unions together, rather than peeling off one at a time, possibly disaffiliate with a clear perspective. I mean, when the FBU disaffiliated, and they disaffiliated because they were being slagged off by left, right, and centre in the party for taking strike action over pay, they left. But they didn't have a political perspective. They just stayed in the political wilderness throughout that period. And there are plenty of people in our unions, I know from the CWU, who have said forever, oh, our union shouldn't be involved in politics. Those people aren't going to vote for an alternative political perspective. So we have to be slightly clear what we're talking about in these things. I think the best perspective we can have at the moment is to push for our unions to fight, to challenge Starmer and so on, to reverse some of the rule changes even. If you want to argue for affiliation, then at the very least argue for collective affiliation, disaffiliation of unions together, with a clear perspective, rather than just wishful thinking.
Thank you, Pete. Glenroy, as a candidate of Tusk, a former candidate of Tusk, how do you see that question?
Oh, yeah, but yes, I understand the issue of Jeremy, and yes, Jeremy is not likely to jump up and say, you know, I want to challenge the leadership, but somebody has to, because if we don't recognize that there is something rotten going on, then we really are just sort of ignoring it, and we're likely to end up with an electoral defeat and victory again for the right, whoever it is, Sunak, Tusk, whoever Truss, whoever it is. You know, and that's the danger. So we have to start talking about an alternative, even if we're not members of the party, because there is that relationship, as the comrade said, you know. And the thing that people need to remember about the RMT, I've said it before, is we were expelled from the Labour Party. But even then, we maintain our relationship with certain MPs and relationship with the party still. The reality for us is that what do we get from it? Bob Crow used to say, what's the difference between an MP or somebody turn up at your door one day wearing a red rosette or wearing a blue rosette if they're going to do the same thing? So it is, Comrade is right about the fact that, you know, we have two Tory parties in the House of Commons. And we need to change it. It's either we're looking for a Labour Party who will oppose these kind of things, and don't forget, austerity has been going on for some time also, and it's still there. No one has said austerity is stopped. We talk about the cost of living correctly. It's now eclipsing the whole thing about austerity. But local government, local council, local Labour council have been carrying out these projects anyway. So if people don't see that there is a need for a challenge inside the Labour Party, and, you know, maybe Jeremy has a role, not just about, you know, re-challenging and become leader, but endorsing somebody or encouraging somebody, because there has to be some kind of challenge. This guy, this Stormer, Sir Stormer, is not leading an opposition party. In the old days, we used to get better from the Church of England and other institutions like that. As an opposition. So we need, as trade unionists, to step that up. But to what ends? Because if we just, you know, and strikes are a motivation, but at the end of the day, those of us who are striking for better condition, we get our better condition, we go home. Those who are striking for better pay, we get better pay and we go home. The political ethos, the thing that is challenging and causing misery to people in this country, is still there. So we can't separate the two. And we haven't in the RMT. You know, it's strange to say about our relationship with Labour Party, where we are now with Tux, but we have a political, a core of people who want to talk politics, who want to be involved and who want to make change. And I think the trade union movement, yes, is at the moment the factor that's actually doing that. But how do we turn it into reality? You know, I hear the talk of general strike. Bob Crow's been calling for that for years when they were the awkward squad, you know. It never happened because of the people we have in the TUC. TUC leadership is changing. Will that make a difference? Will that improve that? Will that lead to anything? I really don't know. But the reality is that we have to start thinking politically, because the Labour Party isn't, and not on our side.
That's a very good point you make. The economic struggle alone will not, you know, end capitalism and will not end the conditions that lead to our economic struggles. They will just repeat and repeat and repeat. So we need a socialist alternative, really. The problem is outside the Labour Party, we have got 20 groups now, perhaps, all with a very, very similar soft left program that say that they're socialist, but none of them really, you know, are taking off. So it's not quite that straightforward. That is a problem. Deepa, would you like to say something in a roundup?
Yeah, Pete's a comrade, but I completely disagree with his perspective on Jeremy, although, I mean, he probably knows Jeremy for a lot longer than I have done. My view is that, you know, I have huge respect for the comrades who have put in years of service into the Labour Party and into the Labour movement. But right now, the system is rigged against us. We cannot keep aspiring to do all the grunt work and then have the positions of power, whether within the PLP or in other positions within the Labour Party bureaucracy, taken by those who are intent on shutting us down every time we go anywhere, we even sniff power. So the Labour left has no space within the Labour Party right now if it has a left agenda, which is why so many so-called left MPs within the Labour Party, within the PLP, are sitting stum when Starmer says don't go on a picket line, abstain on giving free meals to school children. What kind of shameful Labour Party is this that you want to be a part of and that you want to support and that you want to give your membership money to? This is a travesty. They have stolen the Labour Party from us. And we, yes, you know, you can say, oh, we stay and fight, stay and fight, stay and fight. But what about those of us who want an alternative now, not 10 years from now, while you sit and build? And, you know, I've heard comrades talk about the fact that, oh, we're working with soup kitchens, we're working in the community. Great, everybody knows you're working. You were the people who were working before. And you are the right people to be leading this country. Why are you so afraid of going into positions of power and pushing for change from where you can actually make change? And whom do we have within the Labour movement now who is recognizable? Forget about whether he's soft left or whether he's not left enough or whether he's done X amount of crimes in the past. Who do you have within the Labour Party whom you can trust not to sell us out, whom you can trust not to be corrupt, whom you can trust for a range of different things? And the only answer is Jeremy Corbyn. And the answer is not to go and tell him, oh, Jeremy, you're not going to take it. No, we've got to go to him and say, Jeremy, you have a responsibility to us now, because you're the one who got so many of us out. You know, the 14 million didn't happen because, you know, all these people were doing all the work in the community. The 14 million happened because we had a leader who could make change. And we need to get that leader to recognize that he needs to stand up, and there will be other people behind him who are willing to stand. And then, you know, even if he turns out to be kingmaker rather than king, that's good enough, because we will have made change. You're not going to make any change trying to convince Starmer to move leftwards. He's shameless, he is ambitious, and he's thoroughly, utterly unprincipled. So there is no way of going and arguing with these people. You have to recognize that that ship has sailed a long time ago.
Thank you, Deepa. You don't hold back. Mike, would you like to respond to a few things?
Yeah, I hear Deepa's urgency and I share that urgency. And I think we need to understand that we are living in unprecedented times. I was reading today a quote from a US socialist, Michael Harrington, when he was talking about the slow apocalypse of transitioning from one world to another. And of course, Gramsci spoke about old worlds dying and new ones struggling to be born. And God knows that there are plenty of morbid symptoms when we look around the world right now. We could put a name to one or two of them. But the problem arises again and again. I see people, the argument for a general strike. But unless that general strike, even assuming it could be organised, has a political trajectory and a political purpose and drive, it will inevitably not be equipped to challenge the social order and to project a different social order that may be possible and viable and winnable by working class people. So we arrive at the same problem that, to a degree, Sharon Graham and Mick Lynch are trying to articulate. Where do we go with a Labour Party that still has a significant relationship, institutional relationship, with the very trade union movement, who we are rightly tonight lauding for its militancy and the concessions that it is winning from capital for its members? And we have to remember how useful that is. Terms, conditions, incomes matter for people right now, and there are victories that we can point to. But again, we're coming back to the same problem. If we are going to depart the Labour Party, wash our hands of it, give up on it, what do we say to those affiliated unions who still have a significant input? And as someone was saying in the chat box a moment ago, could theoretically entirely transform the Labour Party if they wanted to. If we are going to walk away from that struggle, and let's talk about the options, let's talk about what alternatives are available to us, because I hear Deepa's urgency. We don't have time to gaze at our navels around this. Okay, what is the alternative? where are we going to find this political expression of the kind of working class militancy that we're seeing right now?
Thank you very much, Mike. I think there's a lot of issues there, and this question will not go away anytime soon for the reasons we discussed, the affiliation of the trade unions to the Labour Party, which means a large section of the working class still see it as their party, if you like it or not, and we can't wish it away. Plus the electoral system, which means the left is divided into 20, 30 groups with very similar programs. Something has to happen. I think there's also a space for an organization that actually has stronger views politically, perhaps, and actually talks properly about how to overthrow capitalism, but that's even a step further away, perhaps. But these discussions will be going on, and we are hopefully, you'll join us next week when we are discussing some of these questions, including perhaps, the Jeremy Corbyn party. It's an interesting question. What would happen if he stands as an independent, which I think, as Pete said, I think that's the most likely, actually. He will stand as an independent. What do the unions do? Will they support him? And that raises all sorts of issues then about, being affiliated or not. That could lead to a concerted disaffiliation campaign by various unions. If they do support him, they will be disaffiliated from the Labour Party automatically. So there's all sorts of issues that we could perhaps discuss next week in our program, which is Have Your Say, which is on this issue. And then we hope you'll join us. You can send us your questions or comments in advance. That would help us structure the show a little bit. It's labourbriefingtv@gmail.com. Other issues we'll be discussing is, the affiliation to Labour, the question of syndicalism, what's Unite doing, where's the trade union movement going? So there's still lots of issues to discuss next week. Thank you very much all for joining us today. I thought that was a very useful discussion. Everything is fluid at the moment. I think that's the key to take away. None of us have really the answer, because everything is changing, and with the cost of living crisis and the rise in trade union activity, we could see change happening like that, and quite serious change. So thank you very much, comrades, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Good night.